Welcome to Post-Doom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot, grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm your host, Michael Dowd, and in this episode, I speak with my dear friend and colleague, Dean Spillane-Walker. Dean has been having what he calls impossible conversations for quite some time. He's worked closely with other leading lights in this movement, including Carolyn Baker and Jem Bendell. And I invite you to especially pay attention to how this work and his approach to this work calls all of us into a deeper communion and reconnection with self, others, earth, and soul. Enjoy. I welcome you, and I'm thrilled that we can have this conversation here in November of 2019.
Yeah, good to be here with you, Michael.
And it was great to see you in person too when we came through Medford. That was quite a treat.
Yeah.
So, Dino, before I ask the kind of questions that I've been asking my guests in this series, I'd like to just invite you to not be bashful, but help us get you. Like people who haven't listened to your stuff, read your stuff, they don't know who Dean Spillane-Walker is. Help us understand what you're known for and what you're passionate about and what you're particularly concerned about these days.
I come from a long, number of decades, I guess about 4 decades of working in transformational training of some kind or another, working with corporate groups, training adults to work with at-risk youth, working with intimacy with couples, a number of different kinds of training over many years. And there have certainly been some other occupations thrown in, but mainly that's what I've been doing. And then I add that to an even longer history of personal practices that have connected me with a remarkable set of powerful lineages and wisdom traditions of various kinds, ranging from that transformational training work that I just mentioned, in the old days with the S training and Life Spring and a number of different groups that I ended up participating in and working for, but also a number of energetic and shamanic traditions, and not to mention just direct contact with earth traditions that really kept me alive through a very troubled teenage years, and really brought me from being downright crippled by that very, very difficult upbringing into fairly functional, if I do say so myself, adulthood, and to be able to work with people in the precious and intimate and transformative ways that I've been able to do for all these years. I am just deeply grateful. And oddly enough, since about 7 years ago, when I really got my woke moment of realizing that not only is climate change happening, but abrupt anthropogenic climate change is happening now and accelerating intensively. But a number of other metrics are going on that are actually far more urgent and far more detrimental to us on a short-term basis than climate change. I didn't realize that I would find that to be a threshold, a time of realizing that it really is too late. When I released my book, The Impossible Conversation, in 2017, I realized that with the research that I did to vet this abrupt climate change information, which was mind-blowing, I did vet it, and I could easily see that we're not going to save a damn thing. I as much, and please, we'll get to the point where I can, loop back and say that I'm a huge fan of people stepping up and being activists and so on. But I could just see for myself there that what there was to do was to bring as much beauty and grace and love to this life experience as I can before I die, and to do that with, bringing my gifts. So that's really been my orientation. And ironically, out of the other pieces that I was mentioning, the pieces I had assembled over my lifetime, It's the energetics, it's the transformational work, it's the shamanic work and the deep connection with earth that have come far more to the fore as being, these are the gifts that I can bring. These are the things that we're really starved for as a humanity now. And that's, much to my surprise, because we live in a life hack world, and, the 6 easy steps to something or other. And I'm seeing that those are really hollow in the face of the depth of what we're facing, but
Yeah.
you know that.
I would like you to sort of go further down the path of, how does the language of post-doom work or not work for you? What language you use for our times, our contracting and deteriorating times, and what seems to be unfolding. So let's just start there.
I'm not a big fan of the word doom, just because it, like so many things, are easily encumbered and co-opted for other use and hyper dramatic use. And I'm not a big fan of we got enough drama going on but that's just me in a preference thing.
Sure.
So you've already heard that I'm very much in the camp of we've gone too far, and I've been looking really hard for about 7 years solid now, not to mention going back to 1975 when I got my first instruction from the shamanic instructors that there was nothing to salvage in what I call the business as usual human operating system. There's nothing to salvage, they would say to me. And I was just a kid, and I was, what, are you kidding? I mean, there's all this stuff, and wait a minute, so I took them seriously, but I took their advice and put it in my back pocket. And with my front pocket, I led into living my fully business as usual life for a long time, having to grapple with that. But to jump back into the language of doom that you're asking about.
Well, no, I don't use the word doom. I talk about post-doom. And
okay.
for me, doom is the midpoint between denial and regeneration, because life is about regeneration. Life's going to regenerate with or without us. So for me, doom is the midpoint, the emotional midpoint. I see doom as the inward aspect of collapse. That collapse is sort of the external stuff. Doom is that feeling of, oh shit, when you realize we're not on a perpetual progress train. Yeah. This train is going somewhere else, and it's not to jetpacks and lunar colonies. Right. So, and I identify post-doom, I define post-doom as that which opens, like what opens up when we remember who we are. Yeah. That we are life becoming aware of itself, that we are an expression of life, or part of life, not its masters. So remembering who we are and accepting what's inevitable, and then investing in what's pro-future and soul nourishing.
There are 2 words that come to mind that could tell you a little bit about how I look into a future from here. One is hope and one is grief. I find that hope is really a twisted fragment left over from our ecstatic fossil fuel driven party that's really caused all this destruction that we're talking about. And really, almost every version that I hear of hope has something to do with keeping that party going. Yeah. Even if we have to take it out back and downsize it, it's still going to be a party. Right. And I don't find any use that's remotely like that of the word hope to be empowering at all. I find it to be a not sober word. Yes. In the midst of an AA meeting that is desperately needed. So the other one is grief, and similarly, I don't find much that is honorable or respectable in our holding of grief. And basically that's because I think that the ticket that we had to buy to be a part of, to enjoy the benefits of this business as usual culture, was that we had to give up our connection to deeper self, others, earth, and soul. And really, we probably none of us ever used those words, and we certainly never signed a contract to it, but I have not yet met a person who hasn't sold out virtually all of those pieces. And that's the nature of the work that I do, is reconnection at that level. So
well, let me ask a question along those lines. How do you explain that? Like, if that's the case, which I intuitively think you may be right, how do you explain that?
how do I explain it to
What led to people selling out on those?
Well, when I look at it, we had all the right foundation pieces in place, colonialism, slavery, the annihilation of indigenous cultures. We had those pieces pretty well moving along, but they got this jet fuel overlay from the fossil fuel infusion at the, mostly in the 20th century. And we also had this extraordinary psychological or sociological jet fuel added to this equation, and that was the work that eventually became known as propaganda and all that, from Bernays and a few of his cronies in the early 20th century. And it basically was built. Those are very, very powerful methodologies that are hard to overstate. We don't have the time for it now, but I think we can all agree that the sales side of stuff, making us consumers before anything else, and hyper consumers at that, we can see that influence, and we can pretty much all of us admit, yeah, that's who we are. That's what our whole world is. We're immersed in it. Similarly, there's a disempowerment and an influence, a mass influence on our consciousness in the way that has shown up in our governing systems. And so we are basically a completely disempowered citizenry around the world. Anyone who's wanted to play a part in this game and benefit from it had to give up those sensitivities that would otherwise have said, whoa, something's not right here. This is not right relationship with the earth for us to be clearing these forests for this profit. We're destroying. And that has similar analogs with my disconnection with deeper self, with others, and with soul.
Dean, the thing that's the heart of this particular podcast series is various thought leaders, teachers, coaches, authors related to collapse and climate and overshoot and all that kind of stuff, sharing their stories, sharing their journeys, sharing, like, how did you go from when you grew up? You began touching a little bit on this, but how did you go? Like, what was your worldview like growing up? And then how did that shift? Was it sudden? Was it dramatic? What were any books or people that were particularly instrumental at various times? So share a little bit about, not just a little bit, take as long as you want, about your story of how you came to where you are now in terms of your worldview, and especially in how you've come to what I'm calling a post-doom place.
I feel really blessed that I was introduced to the ocean. Again, I've mentioned a couple of times I had a pretty rough growing up with alcoholic mother and lots of difficulties and so on. And to be connected with the ocean in my preteen years was literally a lifesaver, and it continued to be so, punctuated throughout my life. And not too long after I was introduced to the ocean, I was introduced to Jacques Cousteau, who was an adult, and he was artful, and he was adventurous and an inventor. And he would do his specials on TV, and these would be magical journeys into something I've never seen, this level of beauty in nature before. It's hard to overstate. He would also, in each of these specials on TV, he would also take us to a place where human destruction was obvious to him and his team. And because he had invented this ability to take extraordinary video footage or film footage underneath the water, we could see it, and he would describe, and this, if it continues, this entire area will die. And I would find myself in tears.
Yes.
And no one else in the room was in tears. Bless my parents' hearts, they did what they did. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not like these are bad people or other people were bad. It's just I found myself sensitive to the truth of what he was saying. And then there was a deep impression on me as I took that little nugget of, here is a man I can trust. Here is someone who's vividly painting a picture of the destruction of life on this planet. I knew at I don't know, what was it, 11 years old or something, that the impossibility of infinite growth on a finite planet, I knew it.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that the adults around me were ignoring it.
Mm-hmm.
And I could count on them to continue to do that destruction, because none of them responded to Jacques Cousteau the way I was.
Right.
So that was a massive impression and foundation for me. When I add that experience of the kind of, call it the Jacques Cousteau, and by the way, there was another piece that was cornerstone quality as well, which was Rachel Carson, which my mother taught me about her work very early on. I dedicated The Impossible Conversation, that 2017 book, to both of them, Jacques Cousteau and Rachel Carson. And when I combined my love of Earth through them with the connection with Earth, my getting myself out into the deserts and the ocean and elsewhere, with the kind of shamanic and energetic anchored experiences from then all the way till now, I knew in my heart of hearts that we were not only completely unsustainable, but we were accelerating. This is right in the late 70s. I could see it crystal clear. And I also think I mentioned before that I put my insight about all that in my back pocket, and in my front pocket was, let's go have a wonderful career and do what I'm supposed to do, says all the stories of my culture.
Yeah.
And I had the most wonderful run of doing transformational training work, and oftentimes being able to do that out of doors with people, producing miraculous work in people's personal lives, in my own life, and have my own deep practices going along with it, and flying around from sexy conference center to sexy conference center, and being paid decently to do that. And every year I would have a number of punctuated moments of remembering how far off track I was letting myself get. And so I'm not perfect here, and I haven't fully forgiven myself for having all that knowledge and still being complicit and diving in deeper for a number of years in a row.
Mm-hmm.
But I can say that I have had a magnificent run. I'm deeply grateful, and I do have regrets. I do have things that I'm still doing some deep process work to find a way to let go and forgive and so on, which really took me to Southern Oregon, where I live now and have lived for more than 20 years. And what I can say is that I have been doing that work to bring myself back to center and to core, and to a sense of being empowered and alive, as fully alive as I can muster, even with my history, even with my day-by-day complicity in what we're all grappling with. And that has gone to an entirely new level in this work with the, facing the collapse of Earth and human systems. And what I can say, if there was one word that I can say that wove through all the different kinds of personal practices that I did, all the work that I did and do now, is the experience of grace.
Mm.
And without this experience of grace, I am crystal clear, I would have been dead a long time ago. And I would not have had nearly as much connection with life as I now have. Where that came from briefly was, again, from the practices and the deep experiences that I've been blessed to have in my life. And then uh, a number of extended immersions in that state of grace. And ironically, I'm not a religious person at all. And I've been actually very aggressively anti-fundamentalist religions of any kind, given what I was able to research and see what's been the impact of fundamentalist religions. And it's not been good. Many of my impossible conversations that I've had with people over these past few years in particular have been with people who are fundamentalists, mostly Christians in the USA, but others as well. And I oftentimes find a way that we can speak and go deep with each other and sharing generously with each other when we talk about whatever their version of grace is. Because many of the religious traditions, as you know way better than I do, have some sense of expansion and unity consciousness at their core. And that's what I would call grace. And because particularly the longer immersions in grace that I've been lucky enough to have in my life, I've now got an ability to call up that state basically at will. And that's a part of what I offer in my work when I was describing, just give my gifts to the world best I know how. I can't imagine a more gorgeous gift to be giving to those who are ready, and wanting that kind of experience to add to their life.
I want to just interject because in addition to people, working with you on that, you're using language that's pretty abstract: transformation, groups that, do transformation, grace. Can you name any of the names of organizations or movements or individuals that have been particularly positive for you, that are impactful, that have made a difference, including what you've done work-wise?
I mentioned before there were a couple of the transformational training groups that I ended up working with that were particularly profound, somewhat because of the content that they put together and the quality of the experiences that they offered to those who participated and those of us who worked it. One of those is used to be called the EST training. It's now called the Forum. And I don't know much about it now in terms of it being the Forum. I fell away from all of that kind of work quite a few years ago because it ran flat. So it gave me great tools and deep experiences and deep bonding that was not melodramatic. It was not the usual kind of encumbered relatedness. There was a lot of freedom and power and connection in those early relationships that I was lucky to form with my fellow workers and so on.
I also benefited greatly from the Landmark Forum and Landmark education in general. In the late 1990s, I found that it put together so many different things, because I've also been involved for most of my adult life in various forms of empowerment work, trainings, transformational education, what have you. The ones that I found perhaps most impactful, I ended up becoming a neurolinguistic programming trainer, and Milton Ericksonian hypnotherapy I did for a while. And then the men's work that I did with the new warrior training and the Mankind Project, started by Bill Kauth, who and others, but I interviewed him as part of this series as well. But that was really powerful. And Landmark education. I mean, I went on to become a Landmark Introduction to the Forum leader, and I, might have gone the path of pursuing that as a career had I not been so passionate about this epic of evolution, sort of deep sustainability work with Connie. Yeah. And my son became an Introduction to the Forum leader. So I agree with you. It's not complete. And there are some significant missing pieces, and yet nonetheless, I have found, and several of my family members have found, and I think I've enrolled about 50 people in the Forum over the years,
right.
But found it very powerful stuff in terms of like the how our brains work and how we co-create our experience of reality by what we tell ourselves, and how to take full responsibility for your life, not playing the blame game.
You're inspiring me to mention a couple of different modalities, methodologies that are a part of a toolkit that I've been putting together for myself, and also for any of the people that want to participate in the work that I am creating.
Well, this is great because this is a perfect time, because my next question was going to be what tools, practices, exercises, what's helped you along the path. So
Yeah. The short answer to that question is in my body of work and in my own personal expression of my practices, it's all about reconnection. Because I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, at the core of why I wrote the book and my whole woke moment and so on is what happened to get us to this predicament that we're in. And the answer kept coming back that we've disconnected. We've disconnected from deeper self, from others, from earth, and from soul. And so the simple way to look at my work, in case you ever need a shorter than an elevator pitch, is my work is truly about reconnecting with the web of life in each of those dimensions. So to borrow hugely from Joanna Macy, this is the work that reconnects. And it's at a very different and deeper level than what anything I've experienced from the beautiful people. And Molly Young Brown is a very dear friend. And I just have a very different and I think far deeper take on what it means to reconnect. For me, it involves a deep level of exploration and articulation of that which we've disconnected from. So if I've disconnected from my deeper self, that means I've got a gaping hole of unawareness in myself at my center. And then I'm wondering, why am I feeling so in despair? Why do I feel so helpless in the face of all these problems on the planet? And on it goes. And why do I not feel connected? Why do we not talk with each other about what matters most when I'm thinking about how disconnected I am with other people?
yeah.
And again, the list just is dauntingly long of the costs of our disconnection. And so this work and my own practices are absolutely anchored to either they have some value of reconnecting me and us to the web of life, or they don't get on the list.
This leads me into my next question related to human nature. Basically, do you see, or how do you see human nature either facilitating or hindering us in this, now process of societal cultural deterioration? Is your sense of human nature, just anything you want to say about the whole human nature question?
There are a couple of methodologies that I think are very, very useful. One, that there must be 10 different kinds of circling methodologies. Basic circle, coming together with other people in an intentional way, in hopefully a safe and compassionate way, to be able to invite a richer inner experience and a sense of connecting with others. There's lots of that. And at the most basic level, people need that, because by the default, average person has no clue how to come together with other people in a compassionate, strong, safe way.
Mm-hmm.
There are next level powerful tools and experiences and methodologies beyond that. And those, I think, are the ones that address the next level of your most recent question of how do we address human nature? Human nature, as it shows up in the 20th century, what's gotten us here is separation and disconnection everywhere we look. Mm-hmm. So there's not much right now signaling that we're going to come together in some kumbaya way. The more powerful methodologies beyond the coming together in a simple way in circles, I mean, God bless, that's a great place to start. And people just need to Google circling, and it'll be, you can find it on the web and start to do it.
Right.
But in terms of real, depth of human nature, I don't know of a single methodology. I'm working peripherally with Jem Bendell and forming part of his deep adaptation forum, how do people come together in some significant way to develop what he likes to call deep adaptation. And I think the only real tools that are going to make any kind of substantive difference are going to be ones that have us do deep digging in ourselves, really looking at the shadow in ourselves. How does the individual shadow show up in my life, so that I can put my awareness on that and my intent on that to bring it to some kind of healing. Not to mention how boldly obvious it is that we live in a shadow-driven world. And I don't know of any methodologies that are directly marrying, if you will, the exploration of what Jem calls the deep adaptation work and a really sober look at what's going on in this world. Mm. And so there are a couple of methodologies that I've put together in that inner toolbox that I keep talking about, that really do that deeper work. For those, it's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah.
This is like, you want to do a marathon, or you want to do an ultra marathon. This is how to practice. This is how to train for it. And so I'm very pleased to say that I'm engaged with a number of methodologies with that. And that it's not that everybody's forced to do that. I'm saying there are certain people that know they're willing to step into the hard work that's implied here. I think there's a kind of a just getting by and surviving level that I think the vast majority of us at best are going to get there. They're going to go into the circles. They're going to have a compassionate softness. They're going to forgive themselves. They're going to, it's going to be recycling and changing light bulbs and kind of wringing our hands about how things are so tough. But that's going to be about as good as it gets for many, many people. Mm-hmm. And there are certain people that will just know, all right, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to go to the next level of being alive and as fully present as I possibly can be, no matter what the circumstances are. That takes serious training and serious courage. That's where courage needs to show up. Yeah. And that's one aspect. That's kind of like the steep gradient side of the work that I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, if somebody's watching or listening to this and they find themselves saying, hey, I'm in that second group, I want to know more about this, where would they go? How do they reach out to you? How do they find what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I have the website, which is livingresilience.net, and a podcast, which is a YouTube channel called The Poetry of Predicament. And there's a second kind of a sub set of that Poetry of Predicament YouTube channel, which is, we're calling it Take My Hand, Conscious Parenting in the Face of Collapse and Predicament. And like the summit that you're putting together here, this is a series of conversations. In fact, you're going to be one of those folks. It's going to be good.
Looking forward to it.
So these are the kind of offerings that we're putting together. It's also it is the home of a number of online learning series. So, brief set of 3 or 4 20-minute videos with some support material to particularly highlight a distinction or an aspect of this high gradient work. And it starts at the easiest level, at the level of just what happened, what are some things we can do on a day-to-day living basis to just come together a little bit better, to be a little bit more civil and more connected and more aware in our world. If a person decides to do, like you were just saying, Michael, yeah, I'm one of those people. I'm really ready to do this hard stuff and take on the potentially more life-producing, more life-inducing elements that are really extraordinarily demanding, then I can take these steps in the learning series that we're offering, or the coaching that's offered, or, workshops that are offered. There are going to be all kinds of um, opportunities for people to come together or to study on their own and to take on the level of work that feels right to them. Yeah.
Well, a few more questions I want to invite you to expound on or share your perspective on. One is related to the big picture, the universe story, the epic of evolution, big history or big green history, however it's called, but basically the science-based history of everyone and everything told in a meaningful way. How has that, if that has, informed or assisted you in your work at all?
The work of a woman named Louise Lebrun, and one of the most vocal spokespeople of that work is an extraordinary author and just an inspiring human being named Deb Ozarko. And they offer some of the most clear and piercing articulation of how they deploy their attention, how they look into this world to then participate in this world. And it's, if somebody hasn't heard of either of these two, I would recommend highly checking them out.
Yeah, I had a wonderful conversation with Deb Ozarko just a
Yeah.
few weeks ago, and so she'll also be part of this post-Doom series. Yeah, I agree. She's awesome.
Beautiful. And, bottom line of what I'm trying to relay from her and them is there is, I'm finding less and less usefulness in diving deep into the rivets and bolts and fabric of the history that we've told ourselves, the stories we've told ourselves. I think there's kind of a romantic version of, well, what we are is storytelling beings, and our old story is no longer serving us, so now we need a new story, and it's going to be a really great story, and all religions have been great stories, and blah, blah, blah stories. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be derogatory. I've just found less and less value in that track. There's this phrase in business technology, or business terminology, called there's no cheese down that tunnel. So the mouse that in the experiment goes down and learns the right tunnel to go down to get the cheese. There's no cheese for me down that tunnel of exploring our ways of telling ourselves stories that have ended up with us here. Because all I can find is the death and destruction that got us here. It's extraordinarily difficult for me to winnow out some goodness that I want to weave into some new fabric. What I'm far more interested in is a vibrant and piercing level of awareness in the moment, of presence in the moment. And to borrow again from Deb Ozarko, I love how she defines hope is activated presence. I wish there was some sort of story or set of stories that I could look back on and say, that is so honorable and so respectable, and that's the miracle that humanity has been, and that's been our remarkable, miraculous story that'll then transform itself into some new, even more grand iteration into our future. I don't see it. I don't think we've earned that place in whatever that magical library is in the universe. I think ours is a rather tragic story, and it doesn't involve, at this point, being very present, even as the calling is for optimal presence right now, if we could.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, what I mean by, as you know, the Connie's in my main website is thegreatstory.org. And what I mean by the great story is simply a way of telling the history of physical evolution, biological evolution, and cultural evolution that makes sense of our times, helps us understand how we got in this mess, and can console and inspire us in a post-Doom way, regardless of whether we survive or not. And the big difference between the way I tell that story now from how I told that story prior to 7 years ago is enormous. I mean, I don't even recommend my own book, Thank God for Evolution, anymore, because I still was very much caught in a human-centered, anthropocentric, techno-optimist understanding of things. And I now reject all of that. And so now I still use the phrase, the great story, but what I'm meaning by that is something very, very different. So I appreciate your critique of sort of the fetish of narrative and story, and yet I still am inspired to articulate a worldview, a way of narrating the history of everyone and everything that performs the role of traditional cosmologies, of a traditional creation story, which is, it's not whether this is true in a capital T sense or not, but does this integrate our best evidential and inspirational understandings such that it really does make sense of our times, and then can actually inspire us to that sort of that activated presence of which you were just speaking and what Debo Zarko speaks about. I don't want to load this question. So for me, just to put my cards on the table, I find the fact of impermanence and death to be profoundly inspiring. The fact that I'm going to die, the fact that we as a species are going to go extinct, whether that's in 5 years or 5 million years, it's probably going to be in that window. I find that when I step back, as you know, I think I've done programs for 10 years on a sacred science approach to mortality and death, and that death is the most, or one of the most essential things in life. You can't have a universe without death at all scales. So I find death and impermanence and mortality profoundly inspiring, but not everybody's there. And certainly most of us grew up in homes and families and schools where we didn't get that perspective at all.
Yeah.
So anything you want to say about impermanence and death?
The pleasure, the privilege of doing grief, leading or facilitating grief groups here in the Rogue Valley in Southern Oregon with a wonderful little organization, public service organization that calls itself Winter Spring, offering this kind of grief support and so on. And I've done an awful lot of being with people who are approaching death and those grieving around them. And it is a privilege, and far more often than not, there's plenty of that stuff that I mentioned before that I and others call grace in those moments. And it's not everybody. There are some people that hold on tight all the way to their last breath, but they're way more often than not have big doses of grace as a person is approaching death. And I feel honored to be having had that experience of being with them in that. I can say that I've been close to death a number of times myself, and I don't fear death nearly as much as I fear the ignorance and the polarity and cruelty and so on that's showing up in these times that can cause suffering. The amount of suffering that I predict, even in the very few years that I have left as being an old guy on the planet, I just wouldn't wish that on us. You know, I don't really fear it. Like, I don't lose sleep over it, because I think, to be truthful, that's what I most touch in with grace for, is to remember who I am, which is present here now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the death and the fixation on it and the avoidance of it and so on, that is so culturally abundant, I understand, and I have compassion for our culture, which most people don't have much facility with being present in the face of our mortality. I find it's delicious when I can be in the presence of someone else who we can share the presence of that deliciousness of being very, very present in the face of our own mortality.
Yeah.
And I have huge compassion for the average person in the world who doesn't have that. All they know is it's something to be backpedaled from and avoided at all costs. And I wish us all well, because we're going to have plenty of opportunities to be near to the suffering and death that will be plentiful, again, in my prediction of the coming years.
What's opened up for you on the other side of the sort of stages of grief, on the other side of the doom door, but on the post-doom side, what's opened up? What are they, as Paul Chafurka calls it, finding the gifts?
I want to thank you for mentioning the name Paul Chafurka. I have never met the man, and I know that you have been a huge ally for him for quite some time, and I want to thank you for that. I found his writing to be immensely inspiring for me and very useful for me. So I just thank you for mentioning his name, and I want to honor him. He's a big part of this work, this body of work. And every person who does the intro level of my work will be very familiar with Paul Chafurka. So would you mind repeating your question? Because
Yes, sure.
there.
Paul Chafurka, one of his posts, yeah, I too found his Approaching the Limits website, and he wrote extensively from 2008 to November 2013, and he kind of just stopped writing then. And I just love his writings. And so the question is, what has opened up for you on the other side, beyond mere acceptance? You know, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, there's acceptance, but there can also be that place of finding the gift and being a blessing. So what's opened up for you on that other side?
I think the shorthand version of an answer to that would be that this thing I keep calling grace, this state of being that I keep calling grace, and I'm not trying to say that I coined that phrase by any stretch, but that's what I've been kind of advised to call it, is the ultimate in letting go. There's a deep, deep level of letting go, and I had a meditation practice for 45 years. And I kept thinking I knew what it meant to let go. What does letting go mean in this process in meditation and other parts of growing? And every time there would be a deeper letting go. And so the combination of being able to access this grace, this sense of unity, this sense of ultimate expansion and interbeing with other life, is there, you know, post doom and post all the all the preparations and all the hubbub.
Yeah.
So letting go, there's still a part of grieving for me that is about honoring life.
Yes.
And where my heart goes to grieve is just to remember in as deep an honoring way as I can the impact of various living beings have made on me, like what I was sharing about Jacques Cousteau. And when I think about the whales that I've seen and loved in my life, and the other marine mammals that I'm very, very fond of, and other animals, I could literally keep going on and on in the list of those that I honor, and that breaks my heart, that there is a deep grief in honoring their demise. And through our efforts, good and bad, we have removed them from the planet. And that that is there. It's a bittersweet honoring,
Yeah.
that I now call grief, different than other expressions of grief that I've had for myself in the past. Yeah, the letting go is hard to express in a short and concise way, but it's extraordinarily important here. And this state of grace is hard to overstate, but again, difficult to convey. So I hope I'm conveying just a small fraction of it to folks so they can kind of hear it and resonate or not with what I'm describing.
I too find the word grace really works for me. I mean, I experience and interpret grace as unmerited blessing, unmerited, favor, that I didn't earn it, and we didn't earn it, that it just was given by life, by God, by the universe, by reality. And you know that I use those terms pretty interchangeably.
Yes, you do.
And so I find that Connie and I regularly remind ourselves that we're richer than kings, that we are graced to be alive at such perilous, challenging, terrifying time, and yet it all still feels like grace, that we didn't choose to be alive in a time of industrial rape of the planet. These are systems, economic, political, governmental, religious systems that have been at work for thousands of years that we're inheritors of. And yet we now have several centuries of scientific understanding. So we have and communication that allows us to understand, to learn what's happening all over the planet. And if we try to keep our hearts open, we can stay in grief and a lot. And yet that grief, as Joanna Macy says so aptly and so accurately, is a measure of our love. We wouldn't be feeling that grief if it weren't for our profound interconnectedness and interrelatedness and our love.
Yeah.
And so coming back to that, metaphor of the post-doom doorway that's in the middle of denial and regeneration, with or without us, people avoid that door because they're afraid that doom is the end point. They don't know it's the midpoint. Right. They think it's the end, and they're going to spend the rest of their lives in despair. And yet when they go through that door and allow themselves to begin experiencing these outward spheres of gratitude and presence, activated presence, I like that, they turn back and look at that door that they've now gone through, and it still says WASF at the top, but they experience it, interpret it very differently than they did on the fear side, approaching that what kept them from going through that door, because they knew it meant we are so fucked. But then they turn back and they says, we are so fortunate. And they allow themselves to feel that we are conscious of the fact that we're in collapse. We're conscious of the fact that collapse is existing at all scales, not just human, but biospheric and species. And yet, and we're conscious of the fact that we can actually grieve that and hold that in our hearts without it hardening us to become bitter and cynical and whatever. We can stay in that place of grace, that place of humility, that place of generosity, that place of compassion. And so for me, it's a huge deal finding the gift on the other side of mere acceptance. Acceptance is great. Well, Dean, last question, and then anything you'd like to share to bring this to closure. But what's your take on what's beyond our control, but what still may be in our control? Like, where do you see, what's your sense of what's no longer possible, but what still is possible?
For me to say that I encourage people to find what matters most to them, from as disengaged a place as possible, disengaged from the business as usual human operating system, but to really look newly. Maybe look at, if you had a year to live, what would you do differently and what matters most to you? That kind of a frame.
Yes, exactly.
And so if people want to engage with Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, or if they want to learn the cello or go to Vegas and rack up their cards, I really don't care. Whatever people want to do, I most want people to find what matters most to them as they reconnect with the web of life. What we have the ability to change more than any single thing is how we deploy our attention and presence in this world. And so what I would strongly recommend is that people find the most potent methodologies possible to optimize and maximize their ability to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. Again, that's the work that I was describing earlier as the preparing for an ultra marathon. It takes work to expand these capacities to be present, especially when things get tough, and things promise to get tough. So that's what I would suggest people who are sincerely want to love their children, I would say stop lying to them that the world is just fine and it's just the same way it was 30 years ago or whatever. It's not. And I would strongly suggest for them to find the piercingly difficult path of living their truth from a position of ultimate sobriety that I think you and I have been talking about this whole time. And so back from there, whatever your capacity allows as a portion of that truth, encouraging a portion of that truth in your own children, your own neighbors, your own family members, your own workmates. You may discover as you look at your own work, is this the fulfilling work that I want to be living in this, the most important time in human history? Then continue doing that work. If not, then it might be time to radically change virtually everything in your life. These are obviously choices that can only be made by each individual. But you asked the question, so this is what I would suggest, and certainly this is what I'm doing. And I can't imagine anything more important to be doing than continuing to expand our capacity to be present as alive human beings in this moment, to be able to be present in the face of more and more challenging and stressful situations, and be creative and have some fun. And the thing that I haven't mentioned is just how deeply, deeply love-filled and joyous and rewarding, I mean, soul rewarding it is to engage in that level of practice.
Yes.
Of being alive and of building out those capacities and skills. And it's the hardest thing I've ever done, by far. Hardest thing I've ever done and most fulfilling thing I could ever imagine.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.